Again, number 452. There's within my heart a melody, Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still, in all of life's ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go, feasting on the riches of His grace, resting 'neath His sheltering wing, always looking on His smiling face. That is why I shout and sing. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon He's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown, I shall live with Him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Mark in your songbook to number 283. 283. Then if those that will, let us stand as we sing number 460. 400. Christ has no hands but our hands to do His work today. He has no feet but our feet to lead men in His way. He has no tongue but our tongues to tell men how He died. He has no help but our help to bring them to His side. We are the only Bible the careless world will read. We are the sinner's gospel. We are the scoffer's creed. We are the Lord's last message, given in deed and word. What if the type is crooked? What if the print is blurred? What if our hands are busy with other things than His? What if our feet are walking where sin's allurement is? What if our tongues are speaking of things His life return. How can we hope to have him and welcome his return?
All right, good to see you tonight. Appreciate very much your presence this evening. And I'm glad to be with you again. We look forward, Lord willing, to not only the lesson tonight, but also studies, if the Lord wills, tomorrow. Let's see if I can get this working. All right. Let's see. What may have to do with that. You're right. All right, we got it. Well, we don't have it up here for some reason. Anyway, take what we can get. So it's good to have this opportunity, this privilege to be with you tonight. Lord willing, tomorrow we'll have 2 sessions. And I've made a little bit of a change. I hope to be able tomorrow morning to present a lesson with you and to you on the subject of what the Bible says about old age. Now, this lesson is not for old people exclusively. It's for people who are older and people who plan to get old, and people who are not old. So if you're in one of those 3 categories, I think that maybe the lesson, if we represent it accurately from the Word of God, will be useful to you. And then what I'm going to do in the second session tomorrow, Lord willing, we're going to talk about a very fundamental lesson about the conversion of the eunuch in Acts chapter 8, and just talk about how the gospel hit this man and what he did in response to it. So a very simple, straightforward lesson, but important, and I look forward to those sessions tomorrow. What I want to do tonight, Lord willing, as we've announced, is to talk about the book of Ecclesiastes as presenting a study of a life that's worth living. Now, I'm mighty glad to hear Jeremy talk about how he likes Ecclesiastes, and I trust that others in this audience feel the same way. What I found is a lot of people don't like this book. And I'm sure if I don't like this book, the problem's on my end, not the Lord. It's an inspired work. But there are people, and I'm talking about commentators, folks who written books about the book of Ecclesiastes. And they will write about the terrible pessimism of Ecclesiastes. And I think, I just don't find this book pessimistic at all. I'm not that smart a fellow, but I know it begins with some sobering words and a very dark picture. It doesn't end there. And I think really this book is designed to face some harsh realities, but to point to something that's better. And as you continue reading, and we'll get here in just a minute, at the end of the book, verse 9 of the 12th chapter reads, "And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails, fastened," the old King James says, "by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd." If I understand verse 11, what he's saying is really important. First of all, he makes plain that these words are intended to be goads. You know what a goad is? A goad is a sharp stick you move a stubborn animal along with, for example. And that's what this word does to us. It sort of moves us along. It's intended to motivate us. It's intended to prick us and to make us feel the pain of where we are. He also talks about them being like nails. When I think about a nail, I can't help but think about that old expression we used to use, here's something to hang your hat on. Here's something stolid, something solid, something firm. And so this, in a world filled with all kind of confusion, is something solid. And the point he makes here is these are inspired words. They come from one shepherd. And I think we all know who that shepherd is. But if you go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, we find the expression in 12 and in 1, the preacher. The preacher. The book of Ecclesiastes, that name has always been interesting, hasn't it? If you just, if you're looking, if you have your Bible open, if you just put your thumb over the last 4 letters, that may sound like a very foreign word, but suddenly we might see something that sounds rather familiar. Ecclesia. And as New Testament students, you're familiar with it. Literally, it means the called out. And that word is often translated in the New Testament church. The called out. Now, Ecclesiastes, I should say, is the fellow who does the calling. I don't think he's talking about the New Testament church here. What I think he's talking about it is the idea of a wise man or a preacher who would say to us, come and sit down at my feet and let me tell you something about life. Let me teach you about the way to go. And here is an inspired man doing that. And I believe the inspired man is identified pretty plainly. He's not called by name, but he's identified in every other way as the son of David, as the king in Jerusalem, the wisest man, the richest man. Pretty evident to me he's talking about Solomon. Now, there's some smart folks who disagree with that. But I really don't see any reason to deny that. Now, what that says to me is that this is the proof in my mind that Solomon, we know what a mess he made of his life after such a promising start. But I think this represents Solomon's repentance. I think that certainly the Lord would not speak through a reprobate. And I think that Solomon here is called on to give this service, to speak to us as a wise man, but a man who has been crippled no little by many mistakes, and who calls on us and who says to us, look, I've been down this road of life, and I've been down this road further than you're going to be able to go, and I've explored more than you'll ever explore, and I'm going to tell you there are a lot of things that don't work. There's one thing that does. And I think that's really what Ecclesiastes is about. Now, when you think about that word, boy, doesn't it make this book very practical, timeless. This book was written 3,000 years ago. He's talking about human problems that are as relevant as today. Could have been written yesterday. And I think of this book as a first principles book. We talk about first principles lessons, and many times what we mean, well, we're talking about, what's the role of baptism in conversion, or what's the essence of the gospel that we're to believe? And those are important questions, essential questions. But I think Ecclesiastes may be a layer further down. Why should I care? Why should I look to God? Well, Ecclesiastes would say, because without God, life makes no sense and has no meaning. That's why. And boy, in our modernist world, we need that message. We need to know it and be able to articulate it, share it with other people, above all, believe it ourselves. So I just want to remind you of a few of the lessons of this great old book. And it is a great book, the book of Ecclesiastes, a study about what makes life worth living. And he begins, certainly, with some sober words. If you turn with me to Ecclesiastes, if you haven't already, we'll look here in verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he takes under the sun? So he sets the scene here. He's talking about life under the sun. I think that's an extremely important phrase to understand in context. Because if we don't recognize that Solomon, on the one hand, is talking about the view of life under the sun, and at other times talking about life in a much broader way, then it just seems like hopeless contradiction. It's not. Of course, what it is we find two very different views of life contrasted. And but life under the sun, to my mind, just to put it simply, because I'm a simple guy, I think about life under the sun being life as we see it, life upon which the sun shines. If there's nothing higher than the sun, if this life is all there is, we talk about materialism today, the materialism. The fellow who doesn't really consider the spiritual or God in his equation. He believes in what he can see, what he can touch, what he can smell, what he feel. Well, if that guy's right, and this is all there is, now Solomon begins with a very practical question, which is, what's the profit in life under the sun if that's all there is? And I'll tell you its answer. Its answer is, there is no profit. It's vanity. He didn't say it's vanity, did he? He said it's vanity of vanities. You know, I got a friend of mine over in Mississippi who taught me a good lesson years ago about the Hebrew superlatives. He said, you know, in the Hebrew language, he said, if you want to jazz up a word, they don't use adverbs or adjectives so much. They just repeat the word. So if you're reading in the Old Testament about the holy place and then the most holy place, in the Hebrew, it's just the holy, holy place. And the greatest superlative in the Old Testament is found in Isaiah, where we find not just the holy and the holy, holy, but God is holy, holy, holy. Well, that's true here. This is not just vanity, which means emptiness, nothingness. It's the vanity of vanity. It's the most empty thing you can imagine. What is life under the sun and everything that goes with it? If that's all there is, then what's the use? What's the point? I read an article a few years ago about a guy named Martin Manley. I think it's safe to use his name because he lived up in St. Louis. He was a sports writer. And all this happened when he was exactly my age. I was 60, nearly 61. And so Mr. Manley turned 60 years old. And the article said what he did was he went down to the local police station. He didn't go in the building. He sat down under a tree on the grounds there. He picked up his phone and he called the police to report a suicide. And he took out a gun and he killed himself. Wow. Well, you know, and of course, he knew that the questions would come. And he was a writer. The article pointed out that he was in fairly good health. He had been divorced for a number of years, but didn't have any particular financial problems. But knowing that people would want to ask the obvious question, he left a note in his home in which he said this, and I'm paraphrasing, but pretty well quoted. He said, people will want to ask why. He said, why not? He said, I am, or I was, he used the tense, and you are blips, just blips on the radar screen. The meaninglessness of life. Somebody said, sound like you've been reading Ecclesiastes. My response is, I wish you'd kept reading. You stopped too soon. There are an awful lot of people who come to that harsh realization. They can't realize. What is the point of life if this is all there is? Well, I think Solomon really lays that heavy through the Holy Spirit in this first chapter of Ecclesiastes. One generation passes away. I read the old King James here. One generation passes away. Another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also arises and the sun goes down and hastens to his place where he arose. And the wind goes toward the south, and it turns about unto the north, and it whirls about continually. And the wind returns again according to his circuits. And the rivers run into the sea, and yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. We pause there. Earth, wind, fire, and water. Here are the elements. And the sun arises and sets and arises and sets and over and over and over again. Whenever I read this, I always think about a story I heard years ago about a lady who went to hear an astronomy professor at the local school give a lecture to the public. And she was greatly disturbed because the fellow pointed out during his lecture, he said, well, you know, the sun is actually a great fireball that running on fuel, and it will eventually burn out. And this greatly disturbed this lady. And she caught the guy after his lecture, and he said, now listen, I need to know, did you say the earth would burn out after 5 billion years or 5 million years? He said 5 billion. Oh, good. I'm so glad. I thought you said 5. Difference with it. But, you know, it's been around a long time. And if the Lord wills, it'll be around a long while yet. It's interesting, isn't it, sometimes to look up in the sky and to think, you know, that's the same sun that was shining when the Lord was doing his work on the earth, the apostles. And Moses, for that matter, Adam and Eve, we've just had the one. They saw the same sun that you see. And that's the point. It's been around age after age. The wind, we don't ever run out of wind, do we? Water, seems like it's too wet here and too dry here, but somehow it all seems to balance out at some point. And these things continue, generate. You know what doesn't last? Me and you. We don't last. We're temporary. We're here for a moment and we're gone. And as we're gone, you know, later on in this chapter, look in verse 11. There is no remembrance of former things, and neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that come after. We were talking about Clay County earlier. My folks grew up in Clay County. I never went there, but there is still a cemetery. In a little community called Pleasant Grove. Every place has got a Pleasant Grove. Well, there is a cemetery, and a lot of my relatives are buried there on both sides of my mother and my father's side of the family. And because I was a child of their old age, you know, I didn't know these folks, really. Now, you may have had the privilege of knowing your grandparents and great-grandparents and maybe a couple. I didn't really know my grandparents, to be honest. I know where they're buried. I know their names. And I can see some of the extended relatives, and I can tell you, well, I can read the tombstone, but that's all I know about them. It's amazing. In my case, maybe more extreme, but, you know, just thinking about how many generations we can go back and say we really knew someone. Not very far from me, for sure. My dad died when I was 20. I can't say I knew him like I wished I had. But, you know, here's the other side of that. In a few years, it's going to be my name on the tombstone. And then, you know, who will remember me? If the Lord wills that we live so many years from now. Not me. And there's something about that just bothers people. Well, they just think about how transient life is, how transient we are. Verse 8, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. There's just something about life that's an endless ache. And what has been is what shall be, and what is done is that which shall be done. There's no new thing under the sun. Is there anything where it might be said, this is new? It's been done already. Somebody says, well, we got computers. Yeah, we do. But that's not what he's talking about, is it? I tell you, the thing about, as Bible students, you know this. When you read about people that lived 3,000 years ago, you feel like, well, I know that guy. Because it's the same problems, the same jealousies, the same fears, the same arrogance, the same anger issues, the same abuse, the same. And it does not change. And that's exactly what he's talking about. So, it's a pretty dark start to the book. And what are we going to do about all that? Well, I tell you, verse 13 of chapter 1 reads, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under the sun, or done under heaven. This sore travail has God given the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I think that what we're talking about, and what Ecclesiastes is talking about, is a human problem. In chapter 3 and verse 11, there's a great expression here, where Solomon writes, I think he's talking about God. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. He hath also set, the King James says, the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. I think the word there is olam in the Hebrew. And maybe your translation says eternity. I think that might be a better picture there. God created a lot of creatures, but he didn't make them all in his image. But he gave to man what Solomon calls, by the Holy Spirit, calls here olam, eternity in their heart. My wife has house cats. And I've noticed something about house cats. They don't have midlife crises. You ever noticed that? They just don't. They eat and they find some place to sleep, and they do that most of the day. And they live that way. They live their whole life that way. But God didn't make us to live like house cats. Now, some people do. They spend their whole life trying to ignore reality and ignore mortality. It usually doesn't work. Because we're made differently. And so this is a human problem. How do we deal with the fact that we know in our bones that we are eternal creatures, but we live such a transient life? How does this all fit together? So the search for meaning is really what Ecclesiastes is about. And Solomon said, so I return to consider wisdom and madness and folly, for what can the man do that comes after the king? Only what has been already done. Solomon said, it was my quest to find meaning in life. Now, I think Solomon, you and I know, Solomon began with the answer. And for whatever reason, well, I guess it's not that remarkable when you think about it. He was the smartest, the richest. You know, if you're the kind of fellow, and I'll never be there, but if you find a man who is just praised every minute for how smart he is and how rich he is, how powerful he is, it's not easy. It's not hard, I should say, to lose your head, is it? So he got away from God. And for, I don't know, maybe 20 years. It seems like he hung in there for a while. But certainly for most of the last of his reign, he was wandering around trying to find something outside the box. A friend of mine one time made that point. He said, sometimes young people do that. They grow up within a congregation of people who are just trying to follow God and just follow His Word, and you can't do better than that. And then they come up and they say, well, I just think we need to start thinking outside the box here. They don't know what's in the box. That's their problem.
Amen.
But here we have Solomon looking for answers through his own wisdom and pride and all the rest of it. And then at the end of it, coming back and saying, what a fool I have been. And he says, now look, you can search out those same dead-end roads if you want to. But I'll tell you what you're going to find. You're going to find what I found. And frankly, you won't have the opportunity to go as far or to see as much as I've seen. And I can save you a lot of heartache if you listen to what I'm saying. The Ecclesiastes, calling us to sit at his feet and to learn the lessons instead of learning them the hard way. So that's what Ecclesiastes, I think, is about. And so Solomon said, I spent years exploring, looking for meaning in wisdom and madness and folly. And one of the areas that Solomon specifies early on, beginning there in verse 16 of chapter 1, I commune with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that had been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I gave my heart to know wisdom, as well as madness and folly. And I perceive that this also is vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. I don't think he's talking here about godly wisdom, the kind of wisdom that we learn from listening to God. I think it's the wisdom of this world that he has in mind. We know that Solomon was a highly educated man. If you go back over the histories just a moment in 1 Kings chapter 4, we read that Solomon was given great breadth of knowledge and ability. And he filled his mind with all kinds of subjects. People would come from all around to listen to Solomon lecture on biology and zoology and astronomy, music, art. He was brilliant. And there are a lot of people today who believe that the wisdom of man is the answer. I tell you, they would call it science. Science is the God of the modern world, when you think about it. We define God as anything that men count to be infallible. Have you noticed that? That if you say science says something, everybody's supposed to be quiet. As if men weren't the ones who were coming up with these things and deciding about them. And so, the idea that we can pursue our own knowledge, the atheistic, humanistic teaching that we've had in our schools for the last 100 years, promoted by people who tell us that we don't need to be looking up, we can look within. One of our famous politicians years ago in a famous speech said, man's problems are man-made and man can solve them. Wrong. We cannot. We've made such a mess, there's no way we can get out of it ourselves. That's the first lesson of humility. And because that's lacking, we're never going to get to the right place on the wrong road. But Solomon said, oh yes, wisdom will show me. Wisdom. But what did he find out? I don't think there are many folks alive that would be comparable with the breadth of ability Solomon had intellectually. Not in our day. And so I'll tell you what I found about human wisdom. In much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. I thought about that through the years. You have too. Maybe you got a better answer than I do. What do you mean by that? I don't know specifically. I do know that especially in our age of technology, it's interesting how the more we are capable of receiving information, the more bad news we get. I've noticed that. I've noticed that now, it took maybe several days, or certainly at least a whole day, for my grandparents and my parents to find out about Pearl Harbor, as an example. But now, if there's a bus wreck in the middle of China and a kid is killed, you find out about it 5 minutes later. All the bad news in the world just floods us. And of course, there are people who love to shovel bad news, and there it is. And the more we learn, sometimes the darker things look. And Solomon is a man who could see saw so much he wished he didn't see. I'll tell you something else about the pursuit of wisdom. Over the 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes, and in verse 23, Solomon made this point. He said, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? You know what Solomon realized? He realized what all really wise men finally realized. And I'm trying to say this to young people. You'll go to school and you'll sit at the feet of somebody who claims to know it all. Usually some very superficial individual who's just a slick talker. And I said, one of the ways you can tell whether someone is truly wise or not, wise people know what they don't know. I found that to be true. Whether I agree with them or not about everything, I have learned to respect people who recognize their own limitations. If somebody doesn't have any limitations, you just know good and well he doesn't know. Solomon was a man who knew what he didn't know. And it hurt him, the fact that he couldn't figure it all out on his own, by himself, some other way. So wisdom was not the answer. Well, that's okay. Who wants to sit around thinking all the time? Anyway, pleasure is what we need. Oh, that's where life is. Life and living is in pleasure. And so in chapter 2, I said in my heart, go to now, and I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. Behold, this also is vanity. And I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? And I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. And to lay hold on folly, till I might see that which was good for the sons of men, which they should do under the sun all the days of their life. We're talking now, wine, women, and song. Oh, that's living. Oh, that's where it's at. You think Solomon knew something about wine, women, and song? Women? 700 wives and 300 concubines. I know that's so, and I don't doubt it, but every time I just marvel. I've said before, I think if you gave me a pen and a piece of paper or maybe a notebook, I don't think I could list right now off the top of my head 1,000 people that I know by name. And he was married. I don't know how you remember the names. A lot of these political marriages, okay, whatever. It's still the idea that, that a woman is designed to fulfill the lust of a man, and the more you get, the greater it is, the smarter you are, and the better you are. But I tell you what Solomon realized and came to know by experience. And it's this. That if you've got 1,000 wives, you don't have one. You don't even know what a wife is. You don't know what the marriage relationship is intended to be. And I think about something that he wrote over in chapter 7 and in verse 25. I applied my heart to seek out wisdom and madness and folly. He said in verse 26, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Can't find a good woman, Solomon said. Is that an indictment on women? I don't really think so. I think it's an indictment on the kind of women that Solomon was hanging around, and the kind of women that he chose. He didn't find it to be joy, he found it to be bitterness. Bitter, more bitter than death. And just a little bit of thought would lead you to understand that. I think when you see people, sometimes you see it today in professional athletes who brag about all their thousands of conquests, they've got the money and the fame, and they have several women in every port, as the old saying used to go. And I tell you what they can do. They can just burn out their conscience to the point where they can't even look at a woman properly. To see a human being, they just see something to use. Now, who's the winner and who's the loser in that? They're the loser. Well, Solomon said, I knew that. I learned that the hard way. Talking about wine. I think about that passage over in Proverbs 23 that we've all looked at many times, where Solomon asked the question, who has woe? Who has contentions? Who has sorrow? Who has redness of eyes? Who has wounds without cause? They that tarry long at the wine and go to seek the mixed wine. Don't look at that wine when it's so sparkling and appealing in color. I'll tell you the truth about it. At the last, it bites like a snake. It'll sting like a poisonous serpent. And your eyes shall behold strange women, and your heart shall utter perverse things. And they'll beat you and you won't even know it. And then when you finally wake up, you'll say, boy, I got to get some more of that. Because you've been had. It's an old proverb. It's not a biblical proverb, but I think it's true, and you probably heard it at some point in time. It goes like this. First, a man takes a drink, and And then a drink takes a drink. And then a drink takes a man. You heard that. And you know exactly what that means. He makes the choice. He puts that down his throat. Nobody forced it down. But you know, once he gets that in him, then the drink starts drinking. And then before it's all over, he's on. He's on. I'm not asking for a show of hands here or you to make any statements about this, but I'd be shocked if all of us, especially I can say about me, I've known some good people who were made fools of by alcohol. Isn't that what he said? Wine is a mocker. You suppose he made a fool of Solomon on some occasions too? I've been there. He said, I know. I know what this can do to people. I know I can own them. And yet, here's the thing. I live on the edge of Jefferson County. I found out 88 miles from this building, I found out the other day. And so, out there on the edge of the county, I live right near a beer joint on the highway. And every time I go home at night, I say a prayer of thanks when I get past that joint. Been there for years. And I tell you, and the parking lot usually is filled on certain days. It'll be just full. And I've never been in there. And unless you sedate me and drag me in there, I don't plan to go in there. But you know what? I know what's in there. What's in there are people who think that it's great that the music's loud and the lights are low and their glass is full. And they're looking at the bottom of that glass for something to fill up something missing. And I tell you something, they're not going to find it. You know that, I know that. Solomon knows that. But I've been there. He said, in fact, back to Ecclesiastes, look in chapter 7 with me. And you know this passage. I've used it at many funerals, and I'm sure you've heard it read through the years. It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. But that's the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. And sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool. This also is vanity. What's he saying? Why in the world would anybody think that mourning would be better than mirth? Because this is real. And this is an illusion. And this is people trying to ignore what's real. And by the way, you and I know they use a lot more than just alcohol. I have a friend of mine who worked for years as a prison guard. And he called me here about a year ago and said, what do you know about fentanyl? I don't think he said, no. I said, you need to know about this. And he gave me a little lecture about that for about 20 minutes. And he was right. He said, it's a horrible problem. It's a killer. It's pouring over our border. It's affecting folks in prison and folks out of prison and folks in high school. He said it's the number one killer of young people between 18 and 35, I think he said. Number one killer in the country. People are just, it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? As somebody who early on was blessed to be warned against intoxicants, it just is a marvel to me. You know, why do you hate being sober so badly? What is wrong? There's something missing. Solomon said, let me tell you, whatever you're missing, you ain't going to find it here. I've tried it. It doesn't work. And I wish young and old would learn that lesson. It's a dead-end road. There are other things we got to move on. But, you know, possessions. Solomon said, a lot of people think, oh, man, life is about, Brother Fowler used to make the point, he said, get all you can and can all you get. Yeah. Well, that's not it. Solomon had riches. If you talk about riches, he had it. Chapter 2, I made me great works, verse 4. Built houses, planted vineyards. You see that today, don't you? People got houses, 3 or 4 houses, 5 houses. You know, you can't sleep in one bed at a time, right? Why do you need all that stuff? Well, anyway, Solomon said, I had it. I had more than you'll ever think about heaven. I had gardens and orchards and pools of water and servants. And I had people to play music. He didn't have XM radio. He had service to play music anytime he wanted. I reckon about where he was. And I had gold and silver, especially gold. He had gold. You turn back quickly over to the histories again. I think it's 2 Chronicles 9, where you read one of these little details about Solomon's wealth. Verse 13 of 2 Chronicles 9 reads, the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 606 talents of gold. I don't know, is a talent usually thought of as being 75 pounds? Is he saying there that Solomon had 75 times 666 pounds of gold coming in there? I just can't count that high. You know, I don't know, what is it? I don't know. The gold market, was it $1,500 an ounce or more? More than that, probably. That's Bill Gates' money. He might have had Bill Gates as his yard man, that kind of money. And then he says here, and he talks about the shields and all the elaborate, you know, he had a palace called the House of the Forest of Heaven. These huge cedar pillars and this elaborate decoration. The thing that always gets me is, remember he says, he talks about the throne of Solomon. In verse 17, moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. I'm just reading what it says, and maybe there's something there I'm missing, but it sounds like what he's saying is he had a throne carved out of ivory and then overlaid it with gold, which begs the question to a simple man like me, why would you overlay an ivory throne with gold? Yeah. You could make a wooden throne and overlay it with gold. You know why you do it? Because you can. Because you're Solomon, you're the man, and you've got more money than you know what to do with, and that's what you do. Conspicuous consumption, don't you find that today? Here's some kid from Podunk, Alabama, and he can bounce a ball or catch it or throw it, and so they dump $20 million on him, and suddenly now he's got all this stuff he's buying, and he thinks, well, this is what people do that have got money, and this will make me happy. Solomon said, I had all that, it didn't make me happy. I have more money than ever going to be. And it won't make you happy. Look over at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, I believe it is. And you remember this passage as well, Ecclesiastes 5. He said in verse 10, here's the truth. He that loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver. He that loves abundance will increase. This also is bad. You know the truth? I don't care how much money you got. If you love money, it'll never be enough. That's a fact. It will never be enough. You'll never be able to enjoy it. In fact, verse 11, he said, when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? That is absolutely so. Even at my income level, I have learned the more you have, the more income you have, the more outgo you have. Isn't that right? That's the way it works in this world. And he said, the sleep of the laboring man, verse 12, is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. And that's also true. You don't have to be as rich as Solomon to figure that out. Like the man said, he said, and this is true about Donna and I, we moved to West Virginia, I don't know, 35 years ago, and we could put everything we owned in a little small U-Haul trailers. And, but the more you get, the more you got to paint and lock up and buy insurance for. That's just the reality. And he said, there's a sore evil, verse 13. The fellow sets back riches and he's going to do this and do that with it, but by the time his desired opportunity comes, actually, he's lost it all. It doesn't last. And verse 15 is particularly powerful. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and he shall take nothing of his labor which he shall carry away in his hand. It's a sore evil. And at all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? That's exactly right. You know, and people, I don't care whether you're striving to just make a promotion at the local business or you're talking about a man like Solomon. It does not last. If that's your life, you won't be able to enjoy it and you won't be able to hold it. And Solomon said, if you think having stuff is happiness, I've had more stuff than you can dream of, and it never made me happy. Distract you for a minute. You know, being rich has some advantages. You don't have to worry about paying the bill at the end of the month. But it brings on so many other problems that people like me would never think of because I've never been there. Don't want to be there, by the way. At this time of life, I was talking to some young people the other day. We were talking about gambling and such things, materialism. And I said, you know, I cannot imagine a much more horrible thing than if somebody put my name in the Reader's Digest sweepstakes, if they still have that, and brought me a big check for millions of dollars. I don't have enough sense to do with right what I've got now. And you think right here before I die, you want to put all this money on me and I'm going to have to face God? I don't want that. No, thank you. You take it. It'll buy some stuff. But the Lord said that a rich man is going to have a hard time going to heaven. I want to go to heaven. So, I just think, you know, this is how mistaken people are. It's a mess. We're not going to talk about these other things like I'd like to. But, you know, sometimes we used to hear a lot about social justice. Well, let me tell you, we ought to be people about justice. And we ought to treat people justly. And if we can help somebody and right or wrong, we ought to do that. Don't misunderstand me. But there are some people who I think take it to the point where they really believe we can just make heaven on earth, and we cannot. We cannot. And Solomon came to that realization. In chapter 4, and in verse 1, I returned and considered all the oppressions that were done under the sun. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, for they had no comfort. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comfort. And I praised the dead, which were already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they, that have not yet been, that have not yet seen the evil work that is done under the sun. I was the king, and I couldn't stop it all. Jesus said, the poor you have with you always. He didn't mean let somebody starve at your gate. But if you think that you're going to fix this world, you're not. You do what you can to be a force for good and treat people right. But anything else is an arrogant ambition that is totally unrealistic. And it won't bring you happiness. It'll bring you disillusionment. That's what it's done for generations. Fame and acclaim. You know, he talks in chapter 4 about the young man who grows up poor in his kingdom and he becomes king. And all the people are shouting his name, but you know, pretty soon they'll be shouting the next guy's name. And it is interesting to see that. Fame is a fleeting thing. And maybe this audience is old enough to appreciate this. The greatest athlete I ever saw play in person was Bo Jackson. He played in my wife's high school. And I remember seeing him over there not far from where we live now. And so a friend of mine and I were talking in front of his young teenage sons about men like Bo Jackson and Herschel Walker. And it just stunned both of us when they said, who are they? I don't know. Most famous guy in the world, all the commercials and all the stuff. And then a couple of decades go by, and I don't know who he is. And you can be so famous and then so forgotten. And that's true. And if that's your life is about, and boy, we got a lot of that today, don't we? How many followers you got? How many people are looking at me? Look at me again. Don't miss me. Look at me again. Well, if you get all that, you won't keep it. And it's really so hollow and so empty. Certainly nothing to build your life on. And even religion gets a turn. Chapter 5, Solomon says, keep your foot when you go to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou art upon the earth. Therefore let thy words be few. He goes on to talk about verse 4. When you vow a vow unto God, don't neglect to pay. He has no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better it is that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. What's he talking about? He's talking about the kind of religion that is, as one fellow said, it's a mile wide and an inch deep. It's all about talk, but it has no power behind it. And that's what I think of when I hear people say, well, I tried Christianity. It just didn't work for me. You didn't try it. You just talked about it. If you tried it, you know the power of it. But this is the idea, that just being religious somehow is going to be a help to it. It will not. It will not. So, like Solomon writes in 7:29, he says, Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions, or as one translation puts it, they have sought out many schemes. And that's right. But that's not the book of Ecclesiastes. That's not the whole of it anyway. And, one of my favorite, it's not my favorite book that I've read on Ecclesiastes, but it's my favorite title. A guy wrote a little book on Ecclesiastes, and he called it The Art of Staying Off Dead-End Streets. I thought, that's pretty good. But I don't think that really captures the whole book, does it? That's just half of it. Because I think that the book of Ecclesiastes does not just tell us the wrong answers and what to avoid, but it tells us the right answers. And I'm not going to be able to do justice to this part of the lesson. I appreciate your kind attention, and I appreciate your patience for just a minute. But I have to say something about what I think is really much more important. And that is, what is the real answer? When all has been said, when all has been heard, what does he tell us? Go back to chapter 12. You know this passage. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret good. I'd like to say more about this verse, but there are 3 points he makes here that I think are critical. He says, if you want to live a life that makes sense and will bring fulfillment, you're going to have to acknowledge these 3 things. Number one, you're going to have to know that there is a God. It is the most indefensible philosophical position a man can hold. To argue, and a lot of smart people do that. It's sort of cool to be an atheist. To say that there is no God. I think of that on the same level if I were to spend an hour standing up here saying, I'm not here. You don't see me. I'm not even standing here. That is, I hate to use that word. That is how foolish that is. There's nothing more obvious than the fact that matter does not come from non-matter. It doesn't come from nowhere. And life does not come from non-life. That's not science. That's not even good nonsense. There's a great old argument that's been used for many years, and I'm sure you've heard it. Several years ago on a trip overseas, I bought and brought home a little mantel clock. And with a Westminster chime, and you have to wind it with a key, and when it works, it's got a pretty sound to it. If I was hauled into court and under oath was asked by a judge, who made that clock? If I were to look at him and say, I don't really believe in clockmakers. I've never met one. My theory is that somewhere around here, millions of years ago, there was a great explosion out in the woods. And there was wood flying, and there was sand in the ground that heat and became glass, and there was metal in the... And then over millions of years, all of these different parts slowly formed together and made this clock. That's what I think. That's where the clock is. He would either lock me up for contempt of court or put me in the with the mental health folks. But if I say, now that's how the whole universe came about. Oh, that's science there. Give me a break. So I asked the question, why do smart people, and there are a lot of smart, very smart people, I'm smart than I am, why do they mouth that kind of nonsense? I think it has everything to do with this passage. What he talks about next. He says, fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment with every sin. I don't want that. How do I get rid of the judgment of God? By getting rid of the commands of God. But how do I get rid of the standard of God? I just have to get rid of God. And so that's what people do. But the point Solomon makes is, I'll tell you, you can't make sense of life. You can't make sense of who you are. Go to bed time. That section in Ecclesiastes where he talks about how that man is but a beast, that's not contradictory to the Scriptures. I think what he's saying there, if you accept this idea that there is no God, then let me tell you, you are an animal. You breathe like they breathe, you die like they die, you go back to dust like they do. Who knows what happens after that? You really think you're an animal? Let me tell you the indictment of the world today. They say, yep, we'll take that. We'd rather be an animal than we would be a son of God. It is a tragic mistake. And I'm sure you know this. You know why we have this society falling apart? Because we bought, finally, what we've been taught all these years. We are animals. Animals don't have morals. Animals don't have principles. And it's a pretty ugly way to live. And it's an ugly place to live. So, you want to find happiness, you're going to have to recognize and give God his place so that we can take the place he's given to us and make sense of it. I'll tell you another thing that Ecclesiastes said. It says that once you give God his place, you learn to trust him. Back over the 3rd chapter, another very famous, familiar passage in Ecclesiastes. We've all seen this. We've seen stuff from this passage put on craft shows, and all kinds of things. To every time there is a season, to every time there's a purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to cast away, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. Seemed like I remember back in the 60s, there was some hippie group, that sang a song, made this into an anti-war song. I don't think they had a clue what the Lord was talking about. And again, these phrases are used a great deal, but I'm not sure they're used with much understanding of their original purpose. I like what one fellow said about this. He said, these words are not so much prescriptive as they are descriptive. And what he meant by that was this. This is not a passage to teach us, well, we get up this morning, is today the day to weep or a day to gather stones? That's not what I think he's talking about here. He's describing life. He said, let me tell you, life under the sun is sometimes a step forward and a step back. And sometimes it seems like an endless circle. Notice the next phrase from where we read. Verse 9. What profit hath he that worketh in that which he laboureth? Now that reminds you of chapter 1. It's the same point, made in slightly different words. The vanity of vanities. What profit? And this is the world. It's this endless chase. And what profit? Well, there is nothing to answer that unless we consider God. Verse 10. I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. He's made everything beautiful in his time. God is working. Look at verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. And I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. For there is a time for every purpose and for every work. That's the point. You're not going to be able to look at life and make sense of it and explain everything. Book of Job. You can't go down to the Children's Hospital in Birmingham and explain why these rooms are full. I don't know. I don't know why certain wickedness is allowed to continue as long as it has. But the thing that keeps our sanity glued together is the reality we're not told or promised we're going to know. That goes back to that verse we quoted a while ago about Olam in their heart. Verse 11. That no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. He's working on so many different levels. I had a chance I had to fly out to Texas a few weeks ago. I don't do a lot of flying. And naturally, of course, I had to take a late flight, and then it was delayed for 2 hours. And I'm sitting on the runway, and I'm thinking, the skies are blue here and everything's fine. Why am I sitting on this runway? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the airline's got more than one plane. That's why. And I don't have a clue what's going on over the whole country and maybe the whole world. I'm just one guy with a ticket trying to get somewhere. But these guys have got to be concerned about so many other things. And that's a small thing. And then you think about the providence of God. And I don't understand why this is happening. Well, how about that? Who do you think you are? I'm talking to me. And so this passage is reminding us of that fact. That there are a lot of things in life that don't make sense. But I tell you what makes sense is that there's a God over all. And that, we read that passage in chapter 4 a minute ago about how I praised the dead that were dead more than living yet alive and better not to be born and all that. But don't ever read that verse without remembering chapter 5 and verse 8. Where Solomon says, if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regard, and there be higher than they. Now some interpret that to mean there are higher courts of men. I don't really think so. I think he's talking about God. And he's saying here, you can have confidence in the fact that there is a God who is higher than all, who knows and who will respond in time. And that allows us to find some peace in life instead of being... I'll tell you something else he talks about. He says if you want to find happiness in life, chapter 11, you need to learn how to help other people. Get out of yourself. I think that's the meaning of that rather curious expression. Chapter 11 begins, cast your bread upon the waters, and you'll find happiness. I don't know that I can explain that in a way that will satisfy everybody, but the idea basically is you give to gain. You gain something by giving. I think that's evident enough. He says in verse 2, give portion to 7, also to 8. We think of 7 being the full number. Do more. For thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Notice, he said, don't let the uncertainties of life make you stingy. Let it force you to be generous, because you don't know if you will be able to give tomorrow, so give today. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if the tree fall toward the south or toward the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall be. Thought about that a lot too, and maybe I don't understand it. But I think about the contrast there. You know why a cloud gathers up all that moisture? It doesn't gather to keep it. It gathers to give it. I'll tell you something about a tree. You know, a tree can do a lot of things. When it falls, there it is. So do what you can while you can. Understand we're given for a reason. To look outside of ourselves. Verse 4, he that observes the wind shall not sow, and he that regards the clouds shall not reap. That's right. You can always find an excuse not to if you look for it. Don't look for it. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, a lot more could be said about that. But let me get to one other thing, and then we'll draw it to a close. I appreciate your patience. I tell you, with all that in view, here's another great point from Ecclesiastes. Let me look in chapter 5 and verse 18. Behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he hath taken under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him. This is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. And people who do not know this book very well read that and they say, did somebody change the channel? Is this the same book? What sense does this make? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Enjoy your life. What sense? Well, I tell you, it makes perfect sense. What's the key word in that? Which God gives. And if your life under the sun, that's all you have, it's an entirely different view of things than it is if you see things and the blessings you have as blessings and as the gift of God. And by the way, he didn't just say this one time. You go back to chapter 2 and verse 24, there is nothing better for a man that he should eat and drink and that he should make his soul to enjoy his labor. This also I saw that it was the hand of God. He says that in 2, he says it in 3, he says it in 5, he says it in 7, he says it in 9. Probably I missed a couple. He just sprinkles that through the book. And what's the point of that? The point is that you ought to learn as a God-fearing person to enjoy the blessings that God has given you. And I'll tell you, I may need this lesson more than anybody else here. I'm working on it. But I have said before, I live like I drive. I don't drive fast and I don't drive reckless. But I drive looking right in front of the car in that middle line with my eyes on the road and my mind 1,000,000 miles away. And if you're standing on the side of the road waving, I will not see you. And my wife will say, boy, what a beautiful day today. And I've been driving for 2 hours. I have not noticed. And that's not good. And I've through the years, as an old man now, I think back and I think about a lot of time that I spent thinking about the next thing. I got a meeting next month. I got to be doing this next month. I got this coming next month. I got this coming next time. Well, that's not all bad. We need to look ahead some. But maybe you understand what I'm talking about. You also need to look at today and not live our life. That's what Ecclesiastes is saying, not when. And live your life, enjoy what God has given you today. If you're not careful, I tell you what you can do. You can fail to look your children in the eye when they talk to you. And you can fail to listen to your wife when she's trying to talk to you. Because you're so distracted with things that seem important. But you fail to take today. Now, that's a loss. And you don't get today back. We'll just learn to do better next time. But we just don't get it back. And what Solomon said is, if you want to live a happy life, you're going to have to learn how to live it a day at a time, taking the joys that God gives. Sometimes people say, well, it's how can Christians enjoy anything when there are people suffering? Because it won't do you any good to sit on a thumbtack because somebody else is suffering somewhere. If you can help them, help them. That's what he says in 11. But I'll tell you how a Christian can do it, a God-fearer can do it, is they can take the material possessions that they enjoy and just realize this is a gift of God. And we've got it today. We may not have it tomorrow. It's okay. My life is not wrapped up in it. But today I'll take it as a gift and thank God for it and help others as I can with it. And that's what Paul said, what he meant when he said, I've learned how to be abased and I've learned how to abound. Sometimes folks learn how to be abased and never learn how to abound. Survivor's guilt is a real thing. I've learned that from folks I know that have been through some really hard times. Why am I living if they die? I don't know. But it won't honor God or anybody else to be sorry that you're not dead. What we got to do is just take the gift as a gift and glorify God with it and enjoy it. And give Him the praise. So, let me show something to you before we close. You may have seen this image, you may not have. This is a guy named Richard Dawkins. He's a celebrity atheist. And, these guys, somebody said, you want to know Richard Dawkins' attitude toward God? It can be summed up like this. I don't believe in God, and I hate Him. So these guys spend a lot of time trying to spread the glorious news of atheism. And over in London, they bought ads on the side of the buses there that said, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Let me ask this. What's the key word that you notice in that sentence? Probably. Probably. Hey, don't you drink this. It's not poison. Probably. Hard pass. No thanks. But I'll tell you another word that's weird in that sentence. Enjoy. There's no God. There's no purpose. You came from nowhere. You're going nowhere. You got nothing to do while you're here. What did Mr. Manley say? You're a blip on the radar screen. Now enjoy your life. Don't think so. If you want to find purpose and joy in life, recognize the obvious fact we were created for a purpose and fulfill that purpose. And God be our helper. So, if you're apart from God, the call of Ecclesiastes is make your life count for something. Get out of the rubbish bin, get out of the vanity, and make your life count. And if you're here as a child of God, and most of us here are, I think, then remember this, that we ought to be the happiest, fulfilled people on the earth. And if we're sour and grumbling and we don't seem to enjoy anything and we're miserable and we spread that misery, like the old man said, Paul said, the peace of God that passes all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds. He wrote the Philippians. There's something wrong with a man who claims to have peace with God who doesn't have the peace of God. Something wrong. If that's me, I need to change that today. So, we offer this thought from Ecclesiastes, and we invite you to respond. If you're one who's never obeyed the gospel or one who has obeyed it, but you need to return to the Lord, you've strayed from Him, then please let us know how we can help you. And as we sing this song, let your wishes be made known. Come while we stand and while we sing.
There's a great day coming, a great day coming. There's a great day coming by and by, when the saints and the sinners shall be parted right and left. Are you ready for the judge to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? There's a bright day coming, a bright day coming. There's a bright day coming by and by. But its brightness shall only come to them that love the Lord. Are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? There's a sad day coming, a sad day coming. There's a sad day coming by and by, when the sinner shall hear his doom depart. I know ye not. Are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day?
you so much for your kind attention. I